Okay, this is a recording for the progressive era to try to highlight key points. Um, so what I want you to know by the end is a little bit about the context that led to changes, and then the way that I think the author divides it that's most helpful is to kind of divide administrative progressives versus pedagogical progressives, and specifically there to know a few examples. So administrative to know like Eliot and Coverley, and then some of their key points or things they focused on, and then on the pedagogical progressives, Dewey and Ella Flagg Young. So there's some areas of overlap, but I think two very very different groups with a different focus. To give you a little bit about a little bit of the context, like the progressive era was a period of a huge, like a wave of social change that happened. A lot of things like reform of services, government services, trash collection, trash pickup. So there was a huge wage and a huge wave of change and a focus on populism, the idea of focusing on the needs of kind of common or everyday people. Populism is kind of like a it's just a complex you know idea, and I think you're seeing I always feel like we're seeing like a similar wave kind of related to the progressive era, and one example would be both the kind of two major candidates on both ends of the political spectrum. um, I think people gravitated towards them because they felt like they were outside of the political establishment and focused on the needs on their needs, or at least spoke to them. um, So another example would be like in the progressive era, you saw a wave of change with the temperance movement, the prohibition of alcohol, and today it's kind of interesting for me to see the major change in the focus on marijuana legislation, something that's been discussed in Indiana. One of the major issues in this time that we'll get to is trust or monopolies. Um, and that meant one singular businesses that controlled large areas of services, and in this time it was Standard Oil as one example, and so a lot of people would have heated their homes or run different things through using oil. um, and you had price fluctuations and gouging. So these are also in these three areas. There's key points that I want you to know. So economic reform I just mentioned, were trusts or monopolies. The attempted solutions were breaking up the trust. Wilson was kind of known as a trust buster, or regulating them. Political reform, the major problems were they called them political machines, or like people voting in blocks, corruption, some different things like that. And then the solution here is kind of threefold, and I'll actually kind of walk through those in a minute. And then problems, there was waves of immigration from like Eastern Europe, people who were kind of maybe different culturally and linguistically. And I'll get into those solutions as well. So I just thought I'd point out we have issues today with monopolies still, and this is still sort of a issue in society. So Comcast, and then there was Comcast and Warner. I think we're going to merge, and and a lot of times the government steps in and kind of blocks those, because then they would just easily dominate the entire market and reduce competition. The same happens in the food industry. Um, and you probably hear about these things in different areas. There's a number of different areas where people talk about how things have been damaged by the consolidation of wealth and power. Um, so, all right. I mentioned earlier the problems in political problems were corruption, political machines, those kinds of things. The things that were put in place to deal with that were recall, referendum, and then ballot initiatives. Um, and so these are still in place in most states, and a lot of times today things are voted on through referendum. So one example of this would be school districts I mentioned earlier were harmed by the property tax cap in Indiana. Well, you can put a referendum on the ballot and vote to raise money for schools to provide for things. And a couple different areas have done that. Muncie put a referendum on a ballot to pay for transportation for the bus system. And unfortunately, that referendum failed. There was a lot of misinformation, and so this by far isn't a perfect process, but it is something that still gets used today. And recall in Wisconsin, when there was problems with the governor in relation to the teachers, they recalled him. Um, Another major political reform was that I want you guys to remember and be familiar with is suffrage. Um, this was huge because it added, 50% of our population then earned the right or gained the right to vote. And so women today are still at least a major voting bloc, not in your generation often so much, but the League of Women Voters are pretty active. And you can just see the difference that these two charts back to back illustrate the difference that the election would look like had only women voted versus had only men voted. And what was interesting in the last election when Hillary Clinton ran was some women um, had lived actually through the periods of suffrage. So they had lived in a time when women didn't have the right to vote. This woman is one example, and then they were able to cast their vote for the first candidate for president that was a female. So major change in society. Um, Conservationism became a major focus during this time period. If you're a fan of national parks or have visited some of the national parks, a lot were added during this time period. So I mentioned some of these things, the influx of immigrants under social problems, and Americanization kind of became a focus. And one example of this is Jane Addams. Again, somebody I want you to be familiar with. She was friends with John Dewey. They both lived in Chicago, and she started the Hull House, um, which was an organization to help immigrants. And she focused on additive Americanization. Um, you know, Maintaining immigrant culture, but adding, English and American skills, things they needed to be successful. Jane Addams is known as the kind of matriarch of modern social work. So this is the period where social work really develops as a profession. So that would be one of the lasting legacies. On the other side, with Americanization, the schools tended during this time period to shift towards subtractive Americanization. Um, there was a move and pressure to kind of get rid of immigrant culture. There was a lot of bias and backlash against immigrants that happened. Child labor became another focus during this time period. The elimination of child labor. I've just mentioned it's still around the world today. This is a major issue. One that I noticed a lot when I was in India recently. So, and if you see the signs, we want to go to school, and those kinds of things. One of the key points from the reading that I wanted you to be familiar with is that the primary focus, the reason that unions began was to protect, um, you know, skilled laborers, basically traditionally, to help skilled laborers. And there's a quote there that I want you to remember. To protect the rights of skilled, I think he uses the term artisans. But anyway, again, I've mentioned in the past that prior, to when schools were really prevalent, people would have been, skilled through it or, educated through an apprenticeship. And when you have a skill like masonry or carpentry, that's a complicated skill, like you can take that skill to different places, or you can, trade what you create. Um, but when you have a factory, all you're trading in relation to wages is labor, like just to stand there for a period of time. Like you basically give your time in relation to a certain amount of money, um, and that makes workers incredibly vulnerable because they don't really have a diversified skill set that they can take to different places, or exchange, for labor, or I mean for value or whatever, for money. Um, and I think schools sort of adjusted to this during this time period, and sort of fell in line with the needs of business interests. And I think that still has had a resonating effect on society today, where you see automation basically removing a lot of jobs, um, and schools are really going to have to rethink sort of the future. All right, I mentioned there were different approaches to progressivism, and then um, a major divide that happens. And with administrative uh, progressives, there's a major focus on management of schools and consolidation and centralization, which happened in two different ways. This is the period where you get the formation of the system that we know today. Like, all kids in a neighborhood go to an elementary school, but then they go to a more centralized middle school, and then a much more centralized um, high school. And then also, so consolidation, centralization, and then two, in the form of management, um, you know, principals and then superintendents and school boards happen during this time period, which ends up removing a lot of the control from teachers. And what happened was factories became very, you know, popular, and I think there was a great amount of enthusiasm when, with cars, for example, you can mass produce vehicles for a reasonable price that at least more, could be sold and become more, prevalent in society. And so there was sort of this fascination with factories, and the idea comes, like, try to manage everything in society with the efficiency and kind of management principles of factory work, because kind of known as Taylorism at the time period. Well, I mean, for schools, obviously that's it should be obvious that becomes a very kind of complicated issue. I'm not going to go into depth. In the class, generally, I give it as an example with the development of school boards, how this has affected schools. And Texas is known as one of the most influential states in the nation. The school board in Texas is known as incredibly influential because Texas, unlike most other states, buys their textbooks for the entire state. Every school in the state. In Indiana, each district purchases their textbooks. Well, anyway, there's only one or two major, McGraw-Hill or in terms of textbook manufacturers, and so they have to align their books with the standards of Texas for that market, and that means they really have a lot of influence. And if you're not familiar, like, Texas has had a pretty conservative and pretty somewhat, let's just say, an interesting school board at times, who've made some, I think, kind of problematic decisions about content. Um, so, um, a lot of the organization of schools today that we're aware of, the school day, the longer school day, happened during this time period. Um, that's becoming kind of questioned, and America has one of the longest school days in the world, and people kind of rethinking that. Also, really long school years. A lot of people think that the summer break is related to the crops and farmers, but that's not true. Actually, most crops are harvested in the fall. The reason for the summer break is because most schools during this period didn't have air conditioning, and so it would get really hot, and so they we closed over the summer because of air conditioning. High schools became promoted during this time period, and then if you did an extracurricular activity, uh, these became very popular in schools during this time period. All right, I'm going to walk through these figures just kind of quickly, but I would like for you to go over them. Coverly, Eliot were both administrative progressives. Coverly was at Stanford. Eliot was at Harvard. He was the longest standing president of Harvard. Uh, their beliefs, for Coverly, there's a quote in there that you should be familiar with. He talks about immigrants being docile and lazy. He had much of the same views. He was very influenced by people like Goddard and Terman, eugenicists, things like that. Very influential, and he wrote textbooks and promoted tracking, um, putting kids into, like, vocational kind of education curriculums, things like that. Eliot was, you should know him as the head of the Committee of Ten, and again, the longest standing president of Harvard. He promoted the expansion of high schools. He introduced the elective system. He introduced that first to Harvard and then into schools and high schools. So the idea that you would pick your, what classes you want to take, or you have electives, things like that that you choose. And it should be pretty obvious he was incredibly influential on developments in schools. John Dewey, you don't need to know all of them, and we're going to have another period devoted to Dewey, but he was a teacher himself, and then he was at Johns Hopkins, Vermont, and then, but you should know him with Chicago, the University of Chicago, and then Teachers College, Columbia. One of the differences, let me just give an example to talk about their beliefs and contributions. All of them believed in curriculum differentiation, and that means, unlike the common school where it was just a common curriculum for everybody, which was obviously very, I think, done on ethical and positive in a lot of ways, because the idea was that whether you're rich or poor, everybody gets to learn the same material. Both of these sides kind of wanted curriculum differentiation. Administrative progressives wanted one, though, that would prepare a kid for their role in life, meaning like whatever job or employment they're going to take. Dewey and Ella Flagg Young wanted curriculum around the child's interest. They wanted internal motivation, that comes from inside the kid, and so that would be a dividing line between Dewey and pedagogical progressives and administrative progressives. So Dewey, it's like the connection between education and democracy, that you need an educated, for Dewey, democracy is fluid and changing, and problems come up, and you need a society that can deal with those issues. So a connection between, that's one of his most famous books, is Democracy and Education. And then again, the needs of the learner and things like that. We'll focus on Dewey a little more in depth later. Dewey did not have a huge impact on schools at all. The only example I could give here is he developed lab schools, and these are schools situated at universities around the country that use a kind of Deweyan philosophy and are intended to prepare teachers. With Ella Flagg Young, Urban says, look, by everything on paper, she looks like an administrative progressive. She was a teacher, principal, superintendent, but she's a pedagogical progressive because of her beliefs in sharing authority between administrators and teachers. So the idea of sharing authority, and that promotion of child-centered learning and other things like that. She was very influential in developing a teacher union in Chicago. So again, that idea of factories, you can look through some of the quotes here that I think would help you to understand them a little bit better. I liked Eliot's idea of disciplining the mind. Um, yeah, I would just recommend kind of these points. I always think Johns Hopkins had a strong influence. That's Ella Flagg Young with the union, teacher union. So I've gone through some of these key points. Again, the National Society for the Promotion of Industrial Education was very popular during this time period. There's a huge, if you ever drive up from Indianapolis to Chicago, there's a huge vocational school that was, I'm sure, very popular during this time period. That's basically abandoned at this point. But in this part, I just want you to know that 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 things changed a lot with management at this time period, centralization and consolidation. And for democracy, it really removed a lot of power from certain neighborhoods, especially the poor and working class. Um, a lot of times, school boards are made up of business leaders, and people have the money to run for that office, to develop a campaign, those kinds of things. And so it's sort of, there's the feeling that it disassociates the working class and others from control over the school. And then with management, you know, in this time period, school management became a professional kind of career. Like you went to school for it, study for it, but again, that often distanced uh, administrators from teach what's happening in terms of teachers. Um, there's a quote in there in the reading I wanted you to be familiar with. It's from Count Negri. It's public schools became less and less schools of the public basically during this time period. Um, so I wanted to mention in class again. This is something I have a much more in-depth discussion over generally, but teacher associations or teacher unions. I use that word interchangeably. There are two major national organizations: the AFT, American Federation of Teachers, and then the National Education Association. Um, these, again, some of this information might be helpful to know in terms of bonus questions. Um, each of these has kind of influence or in different states around the nation, and then each state has organizations at the state level and the district level. So uh, the NEA is most popular in Indiana. There are some people who belong to the American Federation of Teachers, but only about 1,000. Most teachers who are in a union in Indiana are with the National Education Association, but through the Indiana Teachers Association. So that's the state level is the Indiana Teachers Association, and then if you work in Muncie, for example, you're part of the Muncie Community Schools or Muncie Teachers Association. But the Muncie Teacher Association is connected to the Indiana State Teachers Association. The Indiana State Teachers Association is affiliated with the National Education Association. So it's kind of like a large umbrella or network. Um, some states have stronger unions, some weaker. California very strong, which is where I taught for a period of time. New York very strong. Oh, Indiana's about mid-level. Not as weak as some other states. Um, Indiana's maybe been weakened a little bit in recent years. Um, some of the reasons Indiana's a work to right state. That's kind of what weakened it. Um, Unions can no longer forcefully collect dues from people. Um, I just want to mention a little bit about teacher unions. The reason you might want to join one, and you might talk to teachers about this, and again, it'll come to a personal decision for you. Um, they do offer a lot of times insurance. So if you're ever sued by a parent or something happens, legal representation. Um, I had a student contact me after she had graduated, upset about being treated a certain way or feeling like she was being targeted by her principal. And I mean, one of the only pieces of advice I could give her is, has she talked to a union rep? And she said she had just joined the union after these things started happening. Um, and I knew she was a really good student. I knew she was a really great teacher, so I was really surprised by kind of what was happening. Um, so yeah, there's a number of benefits anyway, influence, and I would just say what's been happening more recently are a wave of teacher strikes that are happening around the country: Virginia, Oklahoma, LA, Arizona, Kentucky. Big question right now whether or not Indiana will go that route. Indiana has one of the lowest paid teachers in the country. Um, they've made some of the fewest gains since the economic recession. You know, so I will say that strikes are very stressful. I was in a strike at a period of time, and I can just tell you it's incredibly stressful and not something I would ever want anyone to go through. Um, they should be avoided at all costs. And I definitely think too that it's important for the unions, if they're going to strike, to do the best in terms of political, um, to also get their message out and to try to change things in other ways, not just through that action. I often wonder today, teacher unions grow up in kind of the model or in the same vein as labor unions, and I often wonder whether or not they would be better off going more in the direction of professional organizations like the American Medical Association, professional organizations, um, and just to, in many ways, to be less political. I just sometimes think today that political orientation or somewhat hurts teacher unions. So, um, and again, it's something I would just really highly encourage you to talk to teachers about when you're student teaching or doing practicums. Just ask for a broad range of different perspectives and thoughts from different teachers, and then you know read and look into the information and see what you think. Political orientation, the union really worked to get Glenda Ritz. She was our last Secretary of Education. We have a new one now. Um, and they were very effective, at least politically. But then Ritz uh, was did not have really a lot of impact because she was, under a Republican administration, so a lot of tension between the two. So this is from an article. I could try to share this with you about teacher pay, but I would just really encourage you guys to read up on that and to engage and to become educated, to understand kind of the situation that's happened since the economic recession. A huge gap has opened up between teachers and other professionals. Um, uh, so, and there's a huge teacher gap in relation to other college educated professionals. It's happened, um, and again, it hasn't always been so dramatic. Um, so and a lot of the strikes that happen have changed things. I mean, teacher pay changed pretty significantly, in a number of different areas. This is something too. We'll talk a little bit more in the future about job protections or what people call tenure. But another way to look at that is due process. The idea that you can't just fire a teacher without some sort of procedure in place. Or yeah. So I hope this covered some of the key points. I'm gonna wrap up and then I'll work on some information related to Dewey.